Okay, today's topic is dairy bread, and it goes as follows. Bread is a staple food, and it's parv, and you eat it at all types of meals. So Chazal were concerned that if you had bread that was dairy, you might eat it with meat, or if it was fleishigs, you might eat it with milk or cheese. And therefore, the Gemara says two things. First of all, is you can't put milk into a recipe that you're making for bread, and you can't grease your oven with animal or chicken fat. Chicken in this case is the same as animal. That's one thing the Gemara says. Second is that if you did that, then the bread can't be eaten at all. I mean, you can't forget about it. If it's a milk, of course you can do it with fleishigs or the other way around, but you can't even eat it by itself, just as is. So basically, it's not kosher. You can't do it, and if you do it, you're not allowed to eat the bread. So two exceptions the Gemara gives are if the bread is very small, so there's no chance you'll forget that it's mochag because it's just so little. You just eat the whole thing in one sitting. The other is if you do some kind of a mark on it or something unusual shape that reminds people that this is not regular bread, and then they'll realize, oh, that's what's unusual is that the unusualness will make them realize that there's something special. Meaning that in this case that it was milchigs or fleishigs. Similar to that is. If you put a piece of meat or cheese if you bake it like that with a piece of meat or cheese on it, like you make a corn dog or a cheese Danish, so then again the person, it may not have such an unusual shape, but there the presence of the meat or the cheese makes it very obvious to people this is milchigs or fleishigs. There's no concern, and since there's no concern you would eat it, that's not the case that Chazal said you should not allow to do. Okay, now, from thinking from that perspective, Rebelsky said like this. He says, the isser is to make milchig bread or to make fleishig bread. But once the bread is already baked and it's finished, it is what it is, then there's no isser at that point to add milk or meat to them. So, for example, the case he was talking about was if you have a slice of bread and you mix it with milchig batter to make French toast, that's okay. The bread is milchig now because it's soaked in milk. There's a lot of dairy to it. But in theory, someone might eat that bread with meat. But the bread, as it was baked, was parv, and that's all Chazal asked was the baking of bread that was milchigs or fleishigs. In this case, you baked it as parv. The fact that afterwards you did something that would make it the same type of concern, maybe someone would eat it with meat, that's not usher, and that's okay to do that. Now, this isser about making milchig bread is obvious a concern that someone could have in their house. If you're making a recipe for bread, you can't include in it dairy ingredients or meat ingredients. But it also comes up a lot, even more so, should I say, in commercial bakeries, who they want to add milk to the recipes. The standard recipes, not in a Jewish home, in the rest of the world, lots of those recipes have milk in them. It helps the bread become more tender, and it also helps form a darker crust. It has to do with the sugars in the milk. It gets a darker crust. So the halacha is pretty straightforward that you can't make it, and if you make it, it's not considered kosher. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. That bread would not be considered kosher. I guess if you were a Jewish person, you wouldn't be allowed to make the bread either. But now let's think about some details of how that plays out and things that could come up that would be a possible things to think about. So what happens if we have a commercial bakery and they make dairy bread, and of course, the bakery is on the Hashgachah, but obviously this bread cannot be certified because it's milchig bread. That milchig bread is not kosher. But they want to make something else on the same equipment and something else that will be milchigs. So from the perspective that the original bread was milchigs and this is milchigs, we don't need the kasher from milchigs to milchigs. The question is, do we have to kasher from milchig bread to something that's kosher? Okay, again, we're not kashering because of the fact that it's milchig as in basar b'chalav, but the question is the fact that it was made as a milchig bread, which is not considered kosher. You're not allowed to make milchig bread, you're not allowed to eat milchig bread. Is that a reason to say that you have to now kasher the equipment before you use it for something else that is kosher? So, Darkei Tshuva has machlokes about this. Different achronim think different ways. Rashachta wanted to say that the machmirim say, well, milchig bread is not kosher, just like anything else is not kosher, and if something's not kosher, you have to kasher. So that seems like the more straightforward way of looking at it. On the other hand, those who are makel understand that when Chazal asked it, they didn't make this usher like, I don't know, like other foods that are like, a piece of chazer is just usher. Over here, what's going on here is the isser is on the person. Don't create dairy bread. Don't eat dairy bread on a person. Not that the bread is a piece of isser, but that the person is the one who has restrictions. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't create it. You shouldn't eat it. But the bread itself is technically not usser. Now, of course, you can't eat it because as soon as you want to eat it, then you're doing the wrong thing. You're not allowed to do that. But the bread per se is not the isser, and Hashgachah thought that was the more correct way of looking at this specific kind of isser, and therefore he held that you would not be required to kasher after someone made, let's say, milchik bread, assuming, of course, the ingredients were kosher. Now, I'll stress again, that's, of course, only if the next thing they're going to make is milchiks. If the next thing they're going to make is going to be parav, like let's say they're making parav bread that will have hashgacha, if the next thing they're making is parav, then you have to kasher for a different reason. And that's just because you can't go from milchiks to parav without kashering. But we're talking about focusing here on the fact that it's a milchik bread that in itself is not allowed to be eaten. Now, another machlekes has to do with what happens if you want to make bread with very, very little milk or meat, very little milk that will be for sure batul b'shishim. So, and again, there's a machlekes about whether you're allowed to do that or you're not allowed to do that. And one way to understand that machlekes is very similar to what Hashgachah said about the previous one, is that if you think dairy bread is a forbidden item, it's isser, well then, putting milk into the bread is a type of a mevatlis l'chatchila. You're creating something that's usser, but you're doing so in a way that avoids the isser by putting in very little of the item that you're not supposed to have, and it would be asas mevatlis l'chatchila. And the mekilim, those who say you can do it, would say is the isser is just you shouldn't be making bread that wouldn't be allowed to be eaten with meat or that couldn't be eaten with milk. But this bread can be eaten with meat because you have very little milk in there. And so it's okay to do that because you're not being vatal on isser. You're not the isser is to make bread that you can't eat with meat. You're not doing that. You're making bread that can be eaten with meat. So maybe you're not doing anything wrong. Well, anyhow, whether that is or is not the explanation for the disagreement, there is a disagreement about that. Whether there's an isser to make to be mevatel l'chatchila, and Mishnah Berurah says you can do it assuming the person was not planning to eat this bread with meat. So he says it's not bitul l'chatchila because you're ein kavanas levatel. You're not trying to put milk into there so that you can eat it with meat. You're trying to put milk into there for whatever reason. You're putting it into there, but not because you plan to eat this thing with meat. So he says that that's not considered bitul l'chatchila. It's ein kavanas levatel. You're not trying to do the bitul, and therefore it's okay. Now that this logic is why you can find English muffins and even some breads that have very tiny amounts of milk in them, and they're certified as being kosher dairy, but they're certified as being kosher. The people who make them are not making them with the intention to eat them with meat. And actually, the logo, the kosher logo says on the D, it'll say whatever Hashgachah it is with a D next to it to say that this is dairy. You're not allowed to eat it with meat. So obviously, that's not the plan to eat it with meat. And therefore, since these are being done in cases where the milk is batul b'shishim, the milk doesn't give any time into the food, and so the people who are giving that hashgacha are taking the position that it's not bitul l'chatchila in this case. Actually, they're actually telling you don't eat this with meat. So there's no one has in mind to eat this with meat, and therefore they consider this to be bread that's mutter. It's not in the category of milchik bread. Now that those people are approaching that from a halachic perspective, but others are concerned that labeling bread as dairy, that's basically what's happening. It's bread, that's dairy, it's labeled dairy, gives it's a marasayan. It gives this very misleading impression that it's okay to have dairy bread, that there's such a thing as kosher dairy bread, which of course you're not allowed to have kosher dairy bread. So I understand that in this case there's something unusual because it's batul and this and that, but to the average consumer who just sees it says, oh, I see that it's okay to have dairy bread, and so therefore there are others who were uncomfortable, thought it was inappropriate to give hashgacha in this kind of a case because of the maras ayin, that it misleading to make people think you can have dairy bread. Now, there are some other questions about maras ayin that we spoke about at a different time, like what about making a bread mix, a powdered bread mix, or chicken seasoning that has dairy ingredients? And is that also a Maris Ein type thing. That's not so much today's topic. I'm just mentioning because it is somewhat related over here. Okay, now I keep talking to you about not having dairy bread. So is the isser to be just to have not to have dairy bread, or is the isser to make something milchigs if it's a food that you would commonly eat with meat, where the same kind of mistakes could happen, it's like some achronim say, like you shouldn't make wine or spices that are milchigs or fleishigs for the same reason. Wine and spices go with all types of foods. You could put spices onto a pizza, and you could put spices into a fleishig dish. So if you make spices that are milchigs or fleishigs, some say that that's not allowed. It's Chazal talked about milchig bread, but they meant anything that's milchigs that would be usually eaten with meat or milk. But most say that that's not true. The Isser is specific to bread. And for that reason, if you go out into the street, you'll find that, or you go to a supermarket, you'll find water and orange juice, tea, margarine, liquid eggs, all kinds of things like this, which are kosher dairy. They're labeled as dairy, even though they're commonly used with meat. Even so, there's no concern to label to have those things as milchigs. Now, I've said that we're following this position that it's okay as long as it's not milchig bread, but the term bread in this case is more expansive than just literally loaves of bread. It also includes foods that are called pasba b'kisnin. Pasba b'kisnin means things that are bread-like, but they're not completely like bread. The kind of things that you make mezarnus if you eat them, but if you're eating enough of them, if you make a meal out of them, you make hamotzi. It includes things like crackers and cakes and pies. So they're bread-like. They're basically made from flour and water, or the bread part of it is made from flour and water, but it has other things, or it's made crunchy, or it has a strong taste of something else. So it's a little like bread, but a little bit not like bread. The bracha on them is mezarnus. Unless you eat a lot of them, then it's hamotzi. So pasva b'kisnin is not classic kind of bread, but for this halacha, that you're not allowed to make milchig or fleishig bread, they are included, you're not allowed to make them. Now, that said, this only applies to things that somebody might eat with dairy or with meat. So let's say crackers or flatbreads that someone might put cream cheese or coconuts onto them would be included in this. But let's say a cherry pie, which is pasol kissin, but nobody puts milk or cheese onto a cherry pie, or meat onto it. They don't do that, so there's no concern. You might, even though you might eat at a dairy meal, that's not enough to make it usher. In this case, it would only be usher if you eat it with milk or cheese itself. Yeah, and the same thing is for pretzels and cookies and cake, and they're pasol kissin, and they can be made with milchigs because I guess there are people who eat them with milk, like you might dunk a cookie into milk, but nobody would eat it with fleishigs. Can't see somebody taking cookies or cake and eating with a piece of meat, and that's okay. Rebelsky said the same thing also is for a pizza crust made with dairy ingredients. So if you think about it, if you're just making pizza crust, not with anything on top of it. Now, if you had put the cheese on top of it, then it would be obvious that it's milchigs, like we had said at the very beginning, that if it's obvious that something is milchigs, then it's not a problem with dairy bread. But let's say you're making just the crust. They were baking just the crust. So in that case, even if you made them with dairy ingredients, so basically it's bread that's milchigs, Rebelsky said, listen, what do you do with a pizza crust? You make pizza out of it. So that's not something that's eaten with meat, at least in kosher circles, and therefore the isser of milchig bread does not apply. One last thing is that the isser to make milchig or fleishig bread is only when it includes dairy ingredients. Like the Gemara's case, you put milk into it, or you put it onto a pan that was greased with animal fat. But if you put it into a pan that had previously been used for dairy or previously used for meat, that's okay as long as the oven and the pan or whatever it is are clean, and you're not planning on eating those things with meat.